Ancient Rome, an empire whose legions carved their name in the annals of history from the shores of Britain to the sands of the Middle East. We admire their discipline, their architecture, their legal system. But what if we told you that behind every stone of the Colosseum and every page of the Gallic Wars lies a monstrous reality that few mention in school textbooks? It was a reality not only of bloody battles and harsh training, but also of a daily exhausting struggle for survival, where every meal could be decisive. Are they ready to face this reality head-on? What if a man woke up tomorrow not in his cozy bed, but on the cold stone floor of a Roman barracks, and his life turned into a hell full of pain, humiliation, and the constant threat of death? Would he be able to survive when his stomach was gnawing with hunger and his mouth was filled with the taste of coarse, tasteless porridge? Is he ready to learn the true price of Roman greatness, measured not in gold and triumphs, but in endless suffering and deprivation that began right on his plate? Today, we will travel to the heart of the Roman legion and try to understand what it is like to be a Roman soldier, especially when it comes to food. Forget the heroic myths, the valiant warriors marching to glory with full bellies. This will be a day full of blood, sweat, fear, and inhuman trials, where every bite of food is an act of survival. We will reveal 10 facts that Hollywood movies will never show you, and after which your perception of the greatness of Rome will change forever. If you are ready for this merciless journey through time and want to know the true price of Roman power, watch this video to the end. The Roman legionary, a symbol of strength and endurance, did not feed on exquisite dishes, but on the simplest and most accessible food product, grain. The daily ration, regulated by statute, was about 1 kilogram of grain per person. Most often it was wheat or barley, sometimes spelt or emmer, older and coarser varieties that required less care and were more resistant to pests, but were coarsely ground and more difficult to digest. This grain was given to him in the form of whole grains, which he had to grind himself on hand mills, or in the form of flour, which as a rule was rarely finely ground and contained a large amount of bran and even impurities. The task of grinding grain was in itself an exhausting part of a soldier's routine. Imagine how, after a march of many kilometers under the scorching sun, after heavy training with weapons and building a camp, a legionnaire had to take up heavy hand mills, mole manuari. These millstones, consisting of 2 stones, were an integral part of every legion. They were carried in the baggage train, and each soldier or group of soldiers took turns grinding their portion. This process required considerable physical effort and time, turning every meal into a continuation of hard work. The dust from the grinding settled on the face, hands, and clothes, penetrating the lungs and creating a constant feeling of dirt and discomfort. Sounds harmless, doesn't it? However, imagine day after day, month after month, year after year, the same thing. The monotony of the diet was not just boring, it was exhausting. A person accustomed to at least some variety will find that their body is constantly deprived of essential nutrients that are missing from a single grain. A daily kilogram of grain provided about 3,500–4,000 calories, which seems like enough for an active person. However, these calories came mainly from carbohydrates, with a critical shortage of complete proteins, fats, vitamins, and trace elements. This led to energy slumps, when a brief surge of strength was followed by apathy and fatigue. Imagine the psychological burden when every meal is not a pleasure, but a necessity, devoid of any taste, texture, or variety. The absence of bright flavors, fresh produce, and aromas that we are so accustomed to today turned eating into a routine and often disgusting process. Soldiers did not eat because they wanted to, but because they had to survive. This led to moral exhaustion comparable to physical exhaustion, giving rise to apathy and despondency that undermine morale no less than enemy attacks. Every grain, every crumb was a witness to his struggle not only with the external enemy, but also with the internal one, with exhaustion, boredom, and despair. How did this affect his health and combat effectiveness when his body and mind were slowly but surely being depleted by such a diet? Did such monotony lead to moral exhaustion, comparable to physical exhaustion, weakening his will to win? If you want to know how the lack of variety slowly but surely killed Roman soldiers, robbing them not only of their health, but also of their joy of life, turning them into faceless machines of war, watch this video to the end. The main dish that legionnaires prepared from their grain rations was puls. This was not the appetizing porridge we imagine today. Puls was a coarse mixture of grains boiled in water. There was no milk, sugar, or oil as we know them today. It was a primitive soup cooked in large camping pots, olas, often over an open fire or on portable stoves. The process was quick and as simple as possible. The grain was poured into boiling water and cooked until it reached a thick, sticky consistency. Sometimes it was lightly toasted before cooking to give it a slightly nutty flavor, but most often it was just boiled grain. The most that could be added for flavor was a little salt if available, or very rarely, if lucky, a drop of olive oil, which was a valuable product and often used for other purposes, or a small piece of salted lard. Sometimes under favorable conditions, when the legion was stationed in a rich area or had access to a market, a few wild herbs gathered during foraging or cheap vegetables such as onions, garlic, or cabbage could be added. But these were rare exceptions, not the rule. Imagine a daily breakfast, lunch, and dinner, 3 times a day, day after day. A plate of thick, tasteless, sometimes slightly burnt, or, conversely, undercooked porridge. It was often so bland that it killed any desire to eat, but hunger forced them to consume it spoonful after spoonful. Its taste could vary from bland to slightly bitter if the grain was old or of poor quality. The smell was neutral, sometimes slightly musty. Despite its high energy value, this diet was catastrophically deficient in vitamins, certain essential amino acids, and important trace elements such as iron, calcium, and iodine. The lack of fresh produce, complete protein, and a variety of nutrients led to gradual exhaustion of the body. Immunity declined, tissue regeneration slowed, bones became more fragile, and muscles lost tone. As a result, this led to the development of many chronic diseases. Soldiers suffered from constant fatigue, apathy, and slow wound healing, which was deadly in combat conditions. Imagine that his body was constantly in deficit, working to exhaustion, but without proper recharging. What was the most terrible scourge of the Roman legionaries, which turned a strong warrior into a walking corpse, causing flesh to rot, teeth to fall out, and unbearable pain, and was directly linked to such a meager, monotonous diet? We will tell you about this later, and it will shock you. Bread, or what remained of it after prolonged storage, was an integral part of the diet, but its quality was far from modern standards. It was not a fluffy, soft loaf from a modern bakery, but rather a hard, almost petrified cracker. Legionnaires often baked bread right in the field, using coarse, unground flour mixed with water. Sometimes sourdough was used for fermentation, but more often than not, these were simply unleavened, dense flatbreads. The result was the so-called panis militaris, soldiers' flatbread, or galettes, which could be stored for weeks or even months. To achieve this, they were baked until rock hard, practically dehydrated to prevent spoilage and mold. The baking process itself was primitive. In field camps, soldiers dug shallow pits, coated them with clay, and then lit a fire inside. When the pit was red hot, the coals were raked out and the raw flatbread was placed directly on the hot clay or stones, covering the pit from above. This bread was unevenly baked, with a hard, often burnt crust and a dense, sometimes sticky crumb. For long-term storage, they were made even drier, turning them into real crackers, bucella, which were so hard that they sometimes had to be broken with a stone. These dry, hard pieces of bread, more reminiscent of bricks than fresh-baked goods, were extremely inconvenient to eat. They could break teeth, scratch gums, and the coarse grains that got into the flour could cause micro-trauma to the mucous membranes of the mouth and esophagus. Digesting them required enormous effort on the part of the body, and their low fiber and fluid content contributed to constipation. To soften them, they often had to be soaked in water or, in the very pasca we mentioned earlier, a vinegar water solution. In addition, the quality of the grain used to make this bread often left much to be desired. It could be infested with pests such as grain weevils or fungi and mold due to improper storage or humidity. Eating such bread led to serious food poisoning, diarrhea, vomiting, and further weakening of the body. Imagine a soldier, exhausted after a march with aching muscles, trying to bite off a piece of this bread, his teeth grinding as he tries to chew it, and every bite causing pain in his gums. It was not just food, but a daily test of endurance. Could this culinary torture have been avoided? Or was bread, despite all its shortcomings, the only hope for minimal satiety on endless marches, saving soldiers from absolute starvation, but gradually destroying their bodies from within? Despite the fact that the Roman army was a powerful military machine, meat was not part of a legionnaire's daily diet. It was a real delicacy that appeared on the table extremely rarely, mainly after successful battles, when the spoils from captured herds could be divided, or in the form of rations of dried, smoked, or heavily salted meat in particularly favorable conditions. Such supplies could be delivered from Rome, but only through well-established logistics chains that required incredible effort and enormous resources. Imagine how hundreds of tons of provisions, including barrels of salted meat, had to travel thousands of kilometers along impassable roads, through mountains and rivers, to reach the field camp. This task alone was more daunting than many battles. Fresh meat was virtually unavailable due to the difficulties of storing and transporting it in the field. Without modern refrigerators, meat spoiled quickly, especially in the hot climate of the Mediterranean or the Middle East. If livestock such as pigs, goats, sheep, or rare cows were slaughtered, they had to be eaten on the same day, which often led to overeating on one day and a complete lack of meat in the following weeks. Most often, soldiers received meat only in the form of offal, which spoiled quickly, or in the form of dried meat, carne secca, or smoked meat, carne fumigata, which was extremely tough, dry, and required prolonged soaking or cooking to become even remotely edible. Its taste was far from that of fresh meat, often smelling of old fat and salt. Imagine a soldier who has not seen meat for weeks or months, while his body is constantly under severe physical stress, marching with full gear, fighting in bloody battles, building camps and fortifications. He desperately needed protein to repair damaged muscles and tissues, to heal wounds, and to maintain his immune system, which was constantly under attack from infections. This led to a chronic deficiency of protein, which is essential for muscle repair, wound healing, immune system function, and overall vitality. Without adequate protein, the soldier's body began to literally break down. His muscles atrophied, his bones became brittle, and his wounds healed extremely slowly, making him vulnerable to infections and chronic pain. His endurance declined, he tired more quickly, and his ability to perform prolonged physical activity decreased dramatically. Short bursts of energy from carbohydrates were quickly followed by complete exhaustion. Psychologically, the constant lack of meat intensified the feeling of deprivation and the hardship of service, emphasizing the low status of ordinary legionnaires compared to their commanders, who could afford a more varied diet. How did they maintain their physical fitness, their legendary strength and endurance? Without the protein-rich diet that their emaciated bodies so desperately needed, was it a miracle that they could function at all? If meat was a luxury, then legumes, lentils, peas, chickpeas, beans, and kidney beans, were the main source of protein for Roman soldiers. They were nutritious, relatively easy to store and transport in dry form, took up less space than grain, and were more resistant to spoilage. They were used to make thick porridges or soups, often mixed with grain. Salted lard, laridum, or fat, usually pork, was added to provide the concentrated energy needed to sustain strength during long marches and heavy battles, especially in cold weather. Lard was relatively cheap and stored well. In some southern regions where it was available, olive oil could also be used, but it was more expensive and was more often reserved for officers. However, there were pitfalls here too, turning this salvation into a real curse. The constant and abundant consumption of legumes, especially in the absence of proper processing and preparation, could cause serious digestive problems. Unbearable bloating, painful flatulence, sharp abdominal pains, and diarrhea. Imagine a soldier already exhausted from marching and lack of sleep, suffering from constant gas and cramps. In the crowded and unsanitary conditions of barracks or campaign tents, where dozens of men lived in cramped quarters, these problems made life unbearable not only for the sick, but for everyone around them. The smell in the barracks became unbearable, exacerbating the already depressing atmosphere. The large amount of salt used to preserve lard and any rare meat had a detrimental effect on the kidneys, causing constant, unquenchable thirst and leading to chronic dehydration. The Legionnaire constantly felt overly salty, his lips were cracked, his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth, but it was almost impossible to quench his thirst due to the lack of clean water or its questionable quality. This dehydration, in turn, exacerbated headaches, muscle spasms, and general weakness, making him even more vulnerable to heat stroke and illness. Imagine a soldier already exhausted from marching, suffering from constant stomach problems, and a painful, unquenchable thirst that cannot be quenched. And every sip of dirty water only increases the risk of a new infection. Could he have avoided these problems? Or did he have to accept them as an inevitable, disgusting but vital part of his service, without thinking about the long-term, devastating consequences for his health that would sooner or later catch up with him? Fresh vegetables and fruits were a real rarity in the diet of a Roman soldier, especially during long campaigns and sieges far from agricultural regions. Their availability depended on the region, the time of year, and the possibility of foraging, searching for food in the area, which was fraught with enormous risks. Without effective preservation methods such as refrigerators or modern canned foods, fresh produce quickly spoiled during transport. If a camp remained in one place for a long time, small vegetable gardens could be set up, and in provinces with permanent garrisons, fields were sometimes cultivated to provide vegetables. But this was the exception rather than the rule for a constantly moving army. As a result, legionnaires suffered massively from vitamin deficiencies, particularly scurvy, caused by an acute lack of vitamin C. Scurvy is not just a vitamin deficiency, it is a slow, agonizing death that turned a strong warrior into a living wreck. Symptoms began with general weakness, apathy, and increased fatigue. Then bleeding appeared. The gums bled and festered, swelling to such an extent that they covered the teeth, which became loose and eventually fell out, leaving gaping wounds in the mouth. The body was covered with terrible ulcers and bruises, even from light touches, hematomas. And old wounds sustained in battle reopened and refused to heal, turning into festering pockets of infection. Bones became brittle, joints swelled and ached so badly that every movement caused unbearable suffering, and muscles weakened and atrophied, depriving soldiers of the ability not only to fight, but even to stand. In advanced stages, extensive subcutaneous hemorrhages developed, turning the skin into a gruesome sight. Death from scurvy was slow and painful, accompanied by unbearable pain, delirium, hallucinations, and then heart failure or accompanying infections. Imagine a soldier who yesterday was strong and full of energy, lying in his tent today, exhausted by disease, unable even to lift his arm, his body slowly rotting away, exuding the smell of decay, and seeing the horror in the eyes of his comrades, who understand that they may be next. Could he have defended himself against this silent but deadly threat that was undermining the army from within, turning every legionnaire into a time bomb? Or was the fate of every soldier predetermined by a vitamin deficiency that neither armor, sword, nor fear could save him from? Water was essential for life, but its quality often left much to be desired, becoming a source of constant danger. The Romans, of course, built magnificent aqueducts and knew a thing or two about hygiene in their permanent cities. But in the field, soldiers had to drink water from any source available. Rivers, streams, lakes, and sometimes muddy puddles or dirty wells that could be contaminated with human and animal waste, corpses, or simply dirt. The lack of adequate sanitation led to massive outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid fever, and other intestinal infections that decimated legions faster than enemy arrows and swords. Many campaigns that could have been won, thanks to superior tactics and strength, ended in disaster due to outbreaks of waterborne diseases. Mortality from disease in the Roman army often exceeded losses from direct combat. Imagine the scene. A legion that has just won a glorious victory is suddenly paralyzed by an epidemic, with hundreds or even thousands of soldiers lying exhausted, suffering from fever and vomiting, unable to hold a shield or sword. To make the water safe to drink, they often used a mixture of wine vinegar, pasca, and water. It was believed that its acidity could kill harmful microbes and improve the taste of stale water. It was the only salvation from the constant threat of infection. Pasca was sour and tart, but the soldiers drank it without complaint, knowing that the alternative could be deadly. But was pasca always available? And how effective was it against all the invisible killers that could pass through even the strongest stomach? Its effectiveness was probably very limited, especially against viruses and parasitic infections. Nevertheless, it was a measure of desperation, better than nothing, giving at least the illusion of control over an invisible enemy. In addition to the pot, soldiers could try boiling water if conditions allowed, but this required time, fuel, and appropriate cookware, which was a luxury in the field. Sometimes, when circumstances were truly desperate, soldiers simply prayed to the gods and drank what was available, knowing that each sip could be their last. To improve the taste of their meager and monotonous diet, Roman soldiers used salt, which was extremely important not only for flavor, but also for preserving food and replenishing electrolytes after strenuous physical exertion and profuse sweating. Local herbs that could be gathered on the march were also popular, and, if they were lucky, the famous fish sauce garum. Salt was so valuable that it was sometimes used as part of payment, hence the word salary, salarium. Imagine how much the legionaries valued this simple but essential ingredient, which could turn bland porridge into something more edible and, at least for a short time, remind them of home and civilized life. Garum is a fermented fish sauce with an incredibly pungent smell and a rich umami flavor that was popular throughout Rome and used as a universal condiment. It was made from fish entrails that were fermented in the sun with salt. Imagine that smell in a military camp. However, its availability in the field was limited. These few additives at least added some variety to the food, giving the legionary some semblance of taste, but they could not compensate for the fundamental shortcomings of the diet. In addition to salt and garum, Roman soldiers could also use other wild plants they found during their campaigns to add a little freshness and vitamins to their food. These could be wild garlic, onions, various herbs, and berries, which not only improved the taste, but also served as a source of essential nutrients that were so lacking in the standard diet. However, this depended on the region, the season, and, of course, luck. Overall, the Roman soldiers' diet was harsh and monotonous, and seasonings were the exception rather than the rule, providing only temporary relief from the constant feeling of malnutrition and longing for normal food. During long sieges or campaigns far from Rome, the problem of supply became critical and turned into a deadly weapon. Supply lines were vulnerable to enemy attacks, and crops in captured territories could be destroyed by scorched earth tactics. Starvation in the Roman army was not a rare exception, but a constant threat capable of breaking any defense in any legion. Rome's enemies were well aware of this vulnerability and often used tactics of attrition to force the Romans to retreat or surrender. Besieged cities and garrisons could withstand assaults, but faced with a slow, agonizing death from starvation, morale broke down. Historical sources abound with examples of how Roman soldiers suffered from hunger, resorting to eating anything they could find: plant roots, tree bark, leather goods, insects, and rodents. In the most horrific cases, which were even recorded by Roman historians, the besieged, and sometimes even the besiegers, resorted to cannibalism, eating the bodies of their fallen comrades or enemies. This was not just a lack of food, it was absolute psychological and physical exhaustion that broke the spirit of even the most steadfast legionaries, forcing them to do the unthinkable in order to survive. In Julius Caesar's writings, for example, there are mentions of cases when his soldiers, besieging Alesia, were forced to eat the meat of their horses, and then even more horrific things just to survive and continue the siege. These extreme measures showed not only desperation, but also the remarkable resilience of Roman soldiers, who were willing to make any sacrifice for victory. Hunger turned people into animals, erasing the boundaries of morality and humanity, and left an indelible mark on the psyche of those who went through this ordeal. The Roman soldiers' diet was strictly regulated, but that did not mean it was always sufficient. Despite the stated norms, the actual quantity and quality of food often depended on a variety of factors. The success of the campaign, the availability of foraging, and the efficiency of the supply system. As a result, chronic malnutrition was the norm rather than the exception. According to historians, a Roman soldier performing heavy physical labor required at least 3,000–4,000 calories per day, but often received significantly less. This constant energy deficit meant that his body was constantly working at its limit, burning its last reserves of energy. This constant lack of nutrients, combined with grueling physical exertion, heavy equipment, and unsanitary conditions, made Roman soldiers vulnerable to disease and reduced their endurance and ability to recover quickly. His body was constantly on the verge of exhaustion, and every march, every battle became not just a test, but a daily test of survival. Nevertheless, it was this harsh discipline and habit of deprivation that made the Roman army so resilient and enduring. They were not weak, they were hardened, accustomed to suffering. The ability of Roman soldiers to function and fight in conditions of constant hunger and discomfort was the result of relentless training and psychological conditioning. Every legionary knew that survival depended on his own endurance and willingness to endure hardship. This resilience in the face of adversity was one of the key reasons for the success of the Roman army, allowing it to outperform enemies who may have been numerically superior but less disciplined and hardened. Roman commanders understood that physical training and the ability to endure hunger and thirst were just as important as weapon skills. We have just taken a glimpse into the world of the Roman soldier's daily diet. It was a world far removed from the lavish feasts of the patricians and the exquisite dishes of the Roman aristocracy. It was a world where every grain of corn was worth its weight in gold, and clean water was a real luxury for which one could give one's life. Roman greatness was forged not only with swords and shields, not only with the strategic genius of its commanders, but also with a harsh grain ration, meager portions of fat, and a daily struggle against hunger, disease, and physical exhaustion. This reality was cruel and merciless. Soldiers lived in constant readiness for deprivation, knowing that their bodies were their main tool for survival, which had to work despite hunger, thirst, and disease. His diet was not just food, but part of a harsh, inhuman reality that shaped his resilience and endurance, and sometimes led to his slow, painful death. He was a cog in the huge, ruthless machine of the empire, and his life was merely fuel for its ambitions. Think about that the next time you see the majestic ruins of Rome, or read about its glorious conquests. Behind every majestic arch, every monumental temple, every page of heroic chronicles lies a story of monstrous deprivation, invisible suffering, and endless sacrifice of those who fell under the onslaught of the Roman war machine. Their daily diet was not a choice but a necessity that determined their lives and their deaths. If this deep dive into the dark side of Roman military history, into its most mundane, but no less shocking aspects, has made you think about the nature of power and cruelty, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos about the most mysterious, shocking, and sometimes frightening pages of history. Click the bell to be the first to know about our new releases and continue exploring the past with us, uncovering its most hidden secrets.